Hello and welcome to Creative Foundations. Every week we'll be exploring a new art technique that is foundational for mixed media projects. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss out on any of these foundational videos. So let's get started on this week's project. So in today's video, I want to share with you how to stamp an image with archival ink and heat emboss using clear detail embossing powder. So first of all, let's talk about the surfaces we're going to stamp on. I have 130 pounds smooth cardstock. This is a very smooth cardstock that should be very easy to stamp on. The next is actually a hot press watercolor paper. Hot press watercolor paper is known for have a very smooth finish for watercolor paper. So it takes water quite well, not as well as cold press watercolor paper, but the beauty of this paper is a much smoother paper, which makes it easier to stamp and heat emboss on. The third example I'm going to use is cold press watercolor paper. This is not one that I would recommend for embossing and stamping on, but I wanted to show you the result you get with it, just so that you are aware of the difference between these three surfaces when you are stamping and heat embossing. So to start with, I've added my stamped image to the acrylic block. And so basically you want to turn your Ranger archival ink pad upside down. This gives you a more crisp image when you stamp and helps with giving better detail and making sure that you actually do cover the entire surface with ink. So you want to basically turn it over and stamp the image. You want to press firmly just to make sure that the full image transfers. If you also have a stamping platform, this also helps to make sure that you get a really great image. So I'm also going to add 2 more images to this for this little card. Again, a little bit of additional ink, figure out where you want to place it, and make sure you don't have too much overlap with the other stamp. There you go. And you'll notice with these slightly thicker line stamps, you don't always get a perfect image in some of these places. You'll notice there's a few little dots, and that's okay because this is a very sketchy style of image, so it's one thing to consider when you are choosing an image. I'm actually going to move to another stamp of that series for the abstract blooms. I actually like this one because it gives a little bit of variation, but not having all the blooms look identical. So I'm going to add this one in here. So you want to actually work as quickly as possible while you're doing this. So I have this little tray that I use, and I'm going to add my clear detail embossing powder on top of it. I like having a clear detail powder. It does help making sure that I actually do get a really good detailed image when I do this. So basically pour it on, tap it off. Anywhere that, by hitting it a couple times on the back, you actually make sure that you do knock off some of the excess. I think I may have tapped a little too hard. So let's try that again. And there you go. You actually have a fair amount of embossing powder on this. You might notice in a few places there's a little bit of extra in places you may not want it. You can always take a fine paintbrush and just remove any excess that is in places you do not want. In that case, I actually did touch that with a paintbrush a little bit. You may want to move your embossing powder out of the way so you don't accidentally melt some of your embossing powder in the container that you prefer not to. So the first thing to do is turn your heat embossing gun. You want to make sure it gets nice and hot before you add it to your image. And what you're trying to do is you're kind of moving it. You don't want to leave it in one spot too long because you could possibly burn the paper. But what you want to do is you want to actually see the embossing powder move from that kind of frosty look to this very shiny look, like right here. By actually putting your paper at an angle, if you lay it flat down, it actually takes longer to emboss. So by lifting it off the surface, you end up getting a much better embossed image and more quickly. So you can see the one flower is pretty much heat embossed, and then we're going to move on to the second one. You're looking for that color change, and you want to make sure the powder is all melted, because if it isn't, it will come off if it isn't fully heat embossed. So when you touch it, it should look fairly smooth and it should feel shiny. So that's a way you know for sure that you have fully embossed this. So I can tell there's a spot here that I didn't do quite as well because I do feel it feels a little bit gritty on the paper. So I'm just going to use my paintbrush to remove anything from the outside. I'm going to give it another quick blast with my heat gun just to make sure it's fully done. So I'm going to show you the same technique, this time using hot press watercolor paper. Again, you just want to stamp your images. You can see my last image didn't stamp quite as well, but I can still kind of work with it. So you'll notice that it doesn't take the ink quite as well as the smooth cardstock. You don't get quite as good of an image. This is where you can use a stamping platform where you can do multiple stamps to try to make sure you get the clearest image possible. Again, any spots that I think might have a bit of extra powder, I wipe off. So as you can see with the super smooth cardstock, you get a very good solid image. The paper is very smooth, it takes stamps very well, and makes for a really good image. Again, the hot press watercolor paper, again, you have a little bit more variation in the image. You can see it's not sucking up the ink quite the same way, and you're not getting necessarily as clear as an image as you would maybe prefer. But the nice thing about this is, again, you can use more water on this type of paper. So something to think about when you are stamping and when you are embossing. As well, anything that has these smaller detail do work a little bit better on the hot press watercolor paper. These very bold lines, you're going to see a little bit more of the imperfections just because of the surface tension with the ink and just how it is absorbing the ink when you are doing the stamping. And for this third type of paper, which is cold press watercolor paper, I'm just going to show you how it stamps on this paper. Again, you have some really large lines. It's the nature of the paper. It has such a rough surface, which helps it take water really well, but it doesn't take ink nearly as well because of this, because of that rough surface. So it's something to consider. Like in this case, I probably wouldn't actually heat emboss this particular one. I would actually probably end up coloring it in with a little bit of marker just to fix the image. I have found, especially with large images, that I have tried using hot press watercolor, cold press watercolor paper, and it hasn't worked all that well. So I generally use hot press over cold press for this type of stamping. So here are the three samples. The 130 pound smooth watercolor cardstock, the hot press watercolor paper, and the cold press watercolor paper. Generally, I would stick to smooth 130 pound cardstock where you can use Copic markers, you can use pencil crayons, you can use even just other inks to color these images. If you're looking to have something with a bit more water, I would suggest the hot press watercolor paper because you're going to be able to get fairly good detail while still getting a really good image and being able to deal with having more water on your project. The cold press watercolor paper I would just generally leave for projects that you do not need a level of detail. They're great for creating just regular watercolor backgrounds. They're good for being able to just do watercolor painting, but I wouldn't necessarily suggest them for stamping. But I wanted to show you all three so you understand what the options are out there and that you're able to find something that works for you. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. As well, if you have any questions, please provide a comment below. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have on this technique. As well, I have my website, hopalongstudio.com, where I have other creative foundations videos and other ideas that you can use for building a creative habit in your own life. I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next time.